All right, everyone, we're going to start our new lecture series on humanism and the new intellectual currents that we see there. Uh, so we're going to go a little bit greater in depth. We're going to look mostly at Italian humanism, and then we will begin turning our attention towards humanism in the Northern Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance in general. So let's first look at the origins of humanism. We can't really look at anything Renaissance-y, shall we say, in Italy without looking at the precursors to the Renaissance in the early 14th century, and in particular, one Italian poet, that's Dante Alighieri, who was famous for his work, the Commedia Divina, the Divine Comedy, in which his character looks at heaven and purgatory and hell, and his influence, particularly on the Italian language, because Dante was writing in Italian, and that becomes very, very important for that vernacular language. And then two later writers who are associated also as early Italian Renaissance writers, Francesco Petrarca and Giovanni Boccaccio. Petrarch was most noted for his sonnets, which he devoted, many of which were in honor of the object of affection, Laura, in the same way that Dante had a similar object of affection, Beatrice. In Boccaccio, we have a work of literature not unlike what Geoffrey Chaucer will later produce in England. For something very series of unrelated stories, or, well, loosely related stories. So, for instance, Boccaccio will tell stories that are set against the backdrop of the plague. So, 10 friends will leave the city of Florence, and they will go to a country house there to sort of hold up in hopes that the plague will pass by. And they're there for 10 days, and each of them tells a story a day. So it's 100 stories, and therefore it's called the Decameron. This is not unlike what, as I said, what Chaucer will do in England, where he will write the stories of different pilgrims who are on their way to the Becket Shrine. Boccaccio does complete his work. Chaucer never really does. Much of the ambitious task of Canterbury Tales is never quite completed. One of the big differences, though, is that we see that Boccaccio is considered to be a Renaissance writer, while just in terms of the timeline and the development of the English language, Chaucer is still considered to be a late medieval English writer. These folks, because they're writing in vernacular languages, really are signaling something new. Their works have to do with some religious things, but in many cases they're not. They're about love and courtly love and relationships and friendships and so on and so forth. And so these are not in any way a theological treatise, and neither, for that matter, is Dante's Divine Comedy. Another hallmark of humanism, though, is that there is a return to the sources of antiquity that are unmediated by commentaries. So this is a time now that the humanists are really very interested in reading Plato, in reading Aristotle, in reading the Latin poets, and not, let's say, like Seneca, the Latin orators, and not having them simply extracted into a commentary and a Christian theologian commenting on how those ancient sources are useful and or edifying in a Christian context. That's something that, let's say, the sentences of Peter Lombard would have done, or the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. Those two were very influential texts throughout the Middle Ages. But now what scholars are interested in doing is going back and reading the original authors in extant copies as much as was possible, and to that extent to read them in the original languages. So it's no longer a question of reading something in a Latin translation or a vernacular translation, worse still, but actually reading it in the original Greek, in the original Latin, in the or the original Hebrew. In some cases, the Western European understanding of some of the Greek philosophy was through Arabic translation. And so, for instance, when Thomas Aquinas and some of the high scholastic theologians of the 13th century were becoming reacquainted with Aristotle, they were understanding it by way of an Arabic translation from the Greek, and then the Arabic was translated into Latin. That really doesn't work very well, because translating into all of those different idioms alters the original meaning of the text. So the idea during the Renaissance was to actually go back and simply learn Greek, and then with that, and ancient Greek for that matter, classical Greek, and then go and actually read Plato and Aristotle and the other philosophers in their original language. One of the most important aspects of this philosophical revival from antiquity was the Platonic revival. There were Byzantine scholars who were starting to move out of Byzantium as that city became, as Constantinople came under greater pressure from the Turkish encirclement in the early 1400s. Of course, Constantinople will fall to the Turks by 1453. Many of the scholars, though, began moving out of the city and moving around Western Europe, in particular to Italy. There were very famous expeditions of Byzantine emperors to actually two parts of Italy during the 1420s and 1430s, and they often brought a retinue with them of very well-known scholars. As a result of this, they brought their learning with them, the traditions of the East, and in particular, what seemed to hit sort of a real chord with folks in the West really was the works of Plato. Aristotle was well known, but the agenda of the humanists really focused on reviving an interest in humanity and a kind of almost a transcendent quality of human nature. Not that human beings really do in fact transcend themselves, but instead of focusing entirely on divinity and a sort of lower understanding of what human beings are, how human beings really fit in with a grander notion of the cosmos and their relationship to a creator. And Platonism, which had always really been kind of enshrined in early Christian theologies, struck a chord with these Western thinkers in the 15th and 16th century in a way that virtually no other Greek philosopher did. In all of that, the humanist agenda really does end up being a repudiation of scholasticism. Scholasticism was seen as too narrowly defined, too theological, too reliant on Aristotle's physics to explain everything, that sort of metaphysical approach that he had to everything. And in many ways, the scholastic inquiry tended to focus on things that many were considering to be far too obscure. Questions like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? Well, technically, the answer to that, according to the scholastics, would be an infinite number, because angels are non-corporeal. They don't have bodies. So you see, it's a very sophisticated way of looking at things. It's very logical, but at the same time, it tends to focus on questions that folks say, well, is that really important? Do we really need to know that? And so humanism then ends up being something that's very much focused on in a way, a practical knowledge. We must say that even though they were very much enamored of philosophy, and Greek philosophy for that matter, there were very few philosophers themselves that emerged out of the humanist tradition. Most of them were simply were applying humanist principles to everyday matters. So let's look at, in terms of sources. I've mentioned much of this already. I talked about how there is a rejection of traditional commentaries and a search for authoritative texts. What that simply means is a way of finding sources that are in the best original version. So, for instance, if it's the New Testament, finding the best Greek versions. Does that mean in all cases that you're going to find an original Greek text, an original manuscript written by the gospel writer from the first century? Most likely not. But it becomes a question of trying to compile as many of the earliest versions of these texts as absolutely possible in the best Latin or Greek or Hebrew or whatever. So that's what that search is, and there was really part of this a real bibliomania. The libraries really started to be established in private residences and in during the Renaissance. Oftentimes, scholars would go plundering old medieval scriptorums and things that the monks had just long forgotten about to try to find these texts. The most important Latin texts, quotable Latin poets, were really valued by civic humanists. Just to be able to pull a line out of Virgil or Livy or Horace or anyone like that was great. You could put in a little Latin tagline to sort of lend an air of quality to your speech. That typically did not happen with Greek. You'll even find today that it's more likely if you listen to usually, let's say, a member of the British Parliament rather than a member of the American U.S. Congress, will most likely throw in a little Latin tag into something that they've been saying. Very seldom would you ever hear anyone quote Greek, because Greek was not as widely known among the larger circle of educated folks in 15th century Europe. Another important analysis of Latin text was Lorenzo Valla. Valla looked at a document called the Donation of Constantine, which had said that which was a letter from the Emperor Constantine to one of the popes as Constantine was leaving to go establish his capital in the east at Constantinople. It said that the Pope was put in charge of administering all the lands in the Western Empire until the Emperor returns. This document was discovered in the 740s or 750s. It had evidently been forgotten for about 400 years or so. It surfaces at around the same time that the Carolingian family is trying to take over France and needs justification for that takeover to depose the earlier royal dynasty, and they appeal to the Pope. It's at that moment that the Donation of Constantine resurfaces, this document, and the Pope's like, well, here we go. Hey, evidently I do have the authority to make you king. And Pepin III says, oh, great, that's very convenient. I'm so glad you found this document just in the nick of time. Well, fast forward 700 years, the humanist scholar Lorenzo Valla takes a look at the Donation of Constantine, and he finds that, lo and behold, the Latin that is being used in that document is not from the early 300s, from the time of Constantine, but it's actually from the middle of the 700s. And so therefore was very much a forgery. This, of course, did not go over well with the papacy because that document was the cornerstone upon which the Pope's temporal authority rested. The Pope certainly has spiritual power over the church, but in terms of ruling those territories in central Italy, that really rested very much on this document being authentic. So it did not go over so well. Greek texts were also quite important in a smaller scholarly community. Byzantine scholars, as I mentioned before, who had come to Italy. There was a Platonistic school that's established, headed by Marsilius Ficino. Platonism really began to challenge the prevailing Aristotelianism and the scholasticism that was heavily reliant on Aristotle. But probably the most important Greek text that would be used during the Renaissance would be the Greek New Testament, which was compiled by a Northern Renaissance humanist, Erasmus of Rotterdam. His Greek New Testament would really be important in terms for university professors and scholars to study the New Testament in the original language, and therefore to draw their conclusions directly from the Greek and not through the Latin translations. One of the things that will do, of course, is since the Latin translation was the basis of the Roman Catholic Church's doctrines, if scholars are going back to the original Greek and saying, well, the Latin translation actually here is pretty bad or isn't great, it actually means this, that in turn undermines the doctrine that was based upon the Latin text. And so it won't be surprising that it will be largely university professors who will be at the forefront of the Protestant Reformation, who will be using Scripture in the original Greek and Hebrew to challenge the teachings of the Church. As humanism matures, it takes a more positive take on the human condition. Pico della Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man is a marvelous essay in which he really basically argues that if man is created by God, then man can't be all that bad. So that to denigrate humanity in a way to always focus on the divine and always focus on God really is doing actually a disservice to God, the Creator. And so therefore that to honor man for his abilities and his ability to adapt. That was actually the sort of the great quote from that. Oh, marvelous felicity of man, that it can change and adapt to different new situations. That's where Pico really posits his greatest compliment to humanity. But that since humanity is created by God, it is worthy of being studied and worthy of being admired. At least humanity at its best. As I said before, it's not philosophical, but it targets the improvement of society, and so we call this civic humanism. Many of the civic humanists target the educational system. There isn't much of one, but those areas where improved educational models are needed. Simply studying the texts of the past and learning from them, being critical of them. Criticism will come later. It's true that many of the folks in the Renaissance were not very critical of old texts. They didn't really analyze them closely. They simply just read them for what they are. Another major aspect of the mature humanist age, it's really, really important for the dissemination of these ideas, is the development in Germany of the Gutenberg printing press, of movable type printing. So now many of these new ideas that we're going to catch on are going to be able to sort of disseminated in mass volumes. And so humanism then can spread, and many of the ideas, whether those ideas are condoned by the authorities or not, those ideas will be able to spread far and wide. So we can't underestimate this simple technological innovation. So just to sort of recap some of the major writers of the period, I mentioned Pico della Mirandola before. Also Marsilius Ficino, he was the head of the Florentine Platonic Academy. His treatise on the immortality of the soul was really one of the first to to advance that sort of new Platonist idea. Niccolo Machiavelli is sort of one of the towering figures. Probably one of the most widely read Renaissance work is The Prince, in which he argues for Italian unity primarily, his big goal in The Prince, and how a single individual could achieve Italian unity, and the means by which that prince would achieve the goal would be by basically any means possible. Machiavelli is one of his sort of famous theses in the book is that it is better to be feared than to be loved. The people are going to respond much more to a healthy fear or awe of their leader rather than a leader that tries at every turn to make the people really like him. Another important Italian writer is Baldassare Castiglione. He writes another very interesting book, probably quite widely read from the Renaissance as well, in which he says that writing about mostly men, but what makes a good government official, a good courtier, is someone who can easily talk about lots of different topics, who has certain abilities, who's not just a bookish academic, can ride a horse well, can dance well, is a sort of all-around type. These are the folks that really, he says, are the ones who are the most charming and can most accomplish the goals of the princes that employ them to do their work for them. And I think that the idea of the Renaissance man, the person who is involved in so many different areas, who can talk about art and music and poetry and literature, but also business and science, and has abilities outside of the conversation, who can be charming, who is sociable, and so forth and so on. That's really sort of the all-around type person, and will be quite successful in life. That's Castiglione's appeal, and many would not necessarily disagree with that. Now we're going to move on very quickly to look at the Northern Renaissance. The spread of the Renaissance to the north and to the west, to Spain, France, Germany, and England, was really a result of the end of the Italian Renaissance, when the French started to invade and the Spanish came into Italy, and then the Holy Roman Empire came into Italy. People were like, oh, what's this Renaissance thing that's going on in Europe, that's going on in Italy? And we kind of like some of these ideas, and so that becomes quite popular and will spread to much of the rest of the continent. One of the big characteristics of Northern Renaissance is that it's sometimes called Christian humanism. The Northerners combined the humanist emphasis on sources and applied it to Christianity in those Christian texts. As I mentioned a moment ago, the study of the New Testament in the original Hebrew and the original Greek. And as I also mentioned, that the critical analysis of those texts will lead in turn to criticism of the doctrines that were based upon them. So they will actively critique the teachings of the church based on the original sources of the Christian, both Old and New Testaments. But aside from sort of their more Christian leanings, the northern humanists also applied, just as the Italians did, applied their new approach to source analysis and study and essay writing to the service of those dynastic kingdoms, to the French monarchy, to the budding Spanish monarchy, to the English monarchy, in supporting them, and in some cases being propagandists for them. Machiavelli would have loved to have been a propagandist for a unified Italian kingdom, but that did not happen. Other writers would be able to do that for France, for Germany, or for France, for England, for Spain. Germany is another case, like Italy, that really doesn't have much unity, so there is no kind of early nationalism that we'll see present too much in Germany, although the Reformation will provide a little bit of a national spirit. Probably one of the most important controversies in the Northern Renaissance was the so-called Reuchlin affair. This is it's sort of a minor footnote, but it really foreshadows something major. Johann Reuchlin was this very influential student and scholar of Hebrew grammar and Jewish learning. And so he was really what, in Christian circles would have been called an Old Testament scholar. He's really all about really understanding it from its Hebrew origins and how the Jewish people understood their texts, the Torah and other Hebrew literature. Well, his writings and his mode of inquiry was attacked by a Dominican scholastic named Pfefferkorn, who was himself a Jewish convert to Christianity and wished to suppress all of that Jewish learning, in effect to kind of defend the faith. There was certainly a very harshly anti-Semitic strain to Pfefferkorn's rhetoric. There's no question of that. Well, here comes the big battle between the scholastics and the humanists. The humanists, led by the great Germanic poet and writer Ulrich von Hutten, defended Reuchlin not against any kind of anti-Semitism. Reuchlin himself was not Jewish, nor were they concerned with the attack on Judaism per se, but they defended Reuchlin's academic freedom to study as he wished, and to apply humanist principles to the area of Hebrew scholarship. That's important for the idea of academic freedom, but it's also very important because when Martin Luther, in the early 1517, publishes his 95 Theses, and he is attacked by other Dominican scholastics. Many of the same humanists who had defended Reuchlin a few years before come to the aid of Luther, and they defend him on humanist grounds for his criticisms of the teachings of the church. So this Reuchlin affair actually betrays a very significant fault line in academic circles in Europe at the time. And finally, the list of writers is very diverse here, and there could be so many more. We've already looked at one, Erasmus of Rotterdam. Erasmus, for his Greek New Testament, is so terribly influential. Somebody would say that Erasmus laid the egg that later Luther would hatch, that it was out of that study of the Greek New Testament that the Protestant Reformation would emerge. His satire in praise of folly, he really takes pot shots at every major institution in Europe at the time. It is quite a funny, amusing read, although the people that he was taking aim at, particularly the church, were not amused at all by it. Sir Thomas More, who would have been a near contemporary of Erasmus, and they had limited correspondence with each other, his famous work, Utopia, in which he looks at an ideal state, an ideal yet nevertheless very authoritarian kingdom, in which kind of equality is enforced from above. It's a very interesting work. Thomas More will himself be a Chancellor of England and employ humanist principles in the defense of his king, Henry VIII, until More himself falls afoul of Henry's attempt to reform the church in England, and More will be executed in 1535. Francois Rabelais and Michel de Montaigne, two examples of French essayists and satirists. Montaigne's On Cannibals is a very interesting little work to read, particularly because he's looking at the way cannibals behave in newly discovered lands, and you get the sinking suspicion that the cannibals don't behave too much better or worse than folks back in Europe. And then finally, another Englishman, William Shakespeare, arguably one of the greatest playwrights of the Renaissance. Well, certainly of the Renaissance, but probably one of the greatest playwrights in world literature. Shakespeare is widely translated and performed all around the world. His stories have a regal quality about them. They have a very earthy quality about them. They are in many ways eminently relatable, and yet tell a true human story. And of course, there are so many of them and so many great plays that's difficult for us to go into any one of them now. But His plays range from comedies, of course, to quite a number of history plays, to dramas and tragedies. All right, well, that's it for this section of lectures. Stay tuned for the next few. Thank you very much for listening.